part of the caution too. Like, we
Uh,
looked into this because we are just interested in exploring truth, and wherever that
We're,
is, and
we're
but
good.
it's
cool.
We're on. So you can, yeah,
Live.
keep going.
I'll let you finish up that thought, Andrew. And
yeah.
then, so
Um, Go ahead.
yeah, so it's been a few weeks. We're all three in different countries and finding it hard to get together. But a couple weeks ago, when I was down here in Costa Rica, we were traveling down to the Osa Peninsula to do some stuff with aquaponics, and we ran into a really cool group of people that were living inside of a community, um, and truly living out communal-based living, where they kind of all share a mutual food supply and they share common amenities and whatnot. And me and Megan just went to go kind of take a look and see what it was all about and what we could learn about what we're doing down here in Costa Rica to apply to the village we're in. And while we were there, we met a really incredible guy that we ended up getting to this deep dialogue, and he started talking about how he came from the Christian faith and he grew up in it, and a few years ago, he was really challenged by all these holes he started seeing in his own faith. And when he went to do his own research, because he was really seeking truth, he found even more holes and more flaws and basically all this man-made junk that's been piled on top of Christianity. And so it kind of turned into this really deep study for him, and he was really seeking truth, and I truly believe that he is, and we, currently I'd say we believe different truths, but we had an incredible conversation, and I respect him a ton for wanting to know what he believes and why he believes it. And so in that we started diving into what made him really renounce his faith, and ultimately he came to the conclusion that Jesus Christ, Yahushua, was made up by the Roman government, and basically he believes in everything of the Old Testament, but had a lot of things that he views as facts that would say that the New Testament is false and that the Roman government made a fake Messiah to gain control over people. And so it was kind of a lot to take in, and he recommended that I go watch this movie called Caesar's Messiah. And so first thing I did, I wanted to watch it because I want to know. And the first thing I did is I presented to Shaw and Andrew, and I was like, hey, we should all watch this together. And they were pumped about it too, and I think we ended up watching it, and we have a lot of thoughts on it, and since then it's just spurred on a lot of studying, and some really great topics. And so we figured that today would just be a starting point into that topic of really the kind of main topics are Flavian's signature, which is what this is all based upon, and this video it's a documentary video called Caesar's Messiah. And I guess I'll pass it off to Andrew, and he can give a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, for sure. As with anything else, we love diving into truth and exploring what's fact versus opinion, and kind of sorting all that out. And with everything else, we don't want to believe anything that is not true. And so if there's doctrines or ideas or even historical perspectives that we've adopted that don't match history, that don't line up with Scripture, that can't be logically and by reason validated, then we don't want any part of that. And one of the very tricky things about this, and just throw a little bit of a warning here at the beginning, if you do go and watch this video, Caesar's Messiah, you better really have a solid foundation on what you believe and why, because it's going to challenge some fundamental things that you might have been taught. And as with anything else, the logic might seem really good, but even on the surface, you have to go deeper. You have to, if they reference Josephus, you have to go read Josephus for yourself, because they're going to make claims about what Josephus' motive was, not necessarily what he wrote, but they're gonna try to paint his motives a certain way, and you have to go read all of Josephus to put that in the context of everything that he wrote and say, does this claim about his motive ring true with everything he wrote, and as far as we can tell, what kind of person he was. And so those are the kind of things that we try to apply to be rigorous stewards of information, and to try to say, does this hold water? And so I think this might turn into a series, and this first kind of launching point I think we'll stay kind of at a higher level and just examine some of the overall claims of this video. We are still in the process of working this through, so it's not, we haven't reached the final verdict on specific things, but it does seem like there are certainly things that stand out to us as being obvious immediately on the surface. And so I've got a bunch of notes. Ken has a bunch of notes. Shaw does too. And this is going to probably be somewhat random. But I just wanted to take a launching point for the topic itself, and throw out the idea that one of the trends I noticed overall
Do you want
was it.
to give a little
Yeah.
bit of background on the video real quick too? So maybe summarize it.
Yeah, in terms of the claims and the kind of what they put together.
Yeah, before you start talking about some of these things that stood out to you, maybe we could provide just a quick background and summary of what the video is about.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, well, Ken alluded to it a little bit in his intro, but overall, what they do in the video is they try to go back and look at historically what how do you explain some of the gaps that exist, some of the things that when you examine the documents and you look at certain things, it appears that there are gaps in terms of Christianity as a religion, and so when you start to go into those gaps, you start to see, obviously there's the fruit, and we know a tree by its fruit, and so if you start with the fruit, you've got major historical things such as the Inquisition, the Crusades. You've got some of these atrocities perpetuated in the name of Christianity. When you pick one of those gaps and you start to go back and try to identify, well, what's the foundation? What's the root? How did that fruit manifest out of something that is supposed to be pure? And what they do, their way of kind of exploring those gaps is to go back to the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, and start to look at the origin of Christianity. And they do this primarily through the lens of Josephus, who was a 1st century historian. And they make the case that Josephus was a few things, the kinds of things that they say, and some of this, many scholars agree with, some disagree with. They say that historically Josephus was a Jew. This is true. They say that Josephus became basically a Roman historian. He defected and was a traitor to his Jewish country and became an official historian of the Flavian dynasty. And there were several Caesars that were part of this dynasty. And so their point is that as historian for the Roman government, he was basically a propagandist. And they start to make connections between things he wrote and things that the early Christians believed, and they build up a case of what they consider to be a fabricated religion, like Ken said, for the purpose of controlling the people. And I think what they miss is that it's interesting because we were talking about this before the podcast. There's a difference between religion and true faith, and there is some overlap because some people who do have true faith are involved in, but they, I think, miss sort of the continuous plan of Yahweh throughout all the Scripture, through the Testament, and they start conclusions based on the surface level observations. So those are some of the highlights. Ken, does that kind of paint a picture of what the video is about? There's so much detail to it.
I think you provide the context to what, I mean, their ultimate conclusion is that the New Testament is a completely fabricated document that was made up by the Roman Empire, and they try to walk through
and the way
like you're saying.
Yeah, and the way they try to demonstrate this, they try to make the case that all of Messiah's documented actions, as we have recorded in the Gospels, they try to make the case that that was really the stories and sort of the legends and everything else actually surrounding the Flavian, a couple of the Flavian rulers, and that Josephus writing, of course, well after the fact, that Josephus was writing about these Caesars, and then people turned that, because there was a connection, obviously, between the Caesar and deity. The Caesars were worshipped as deity, and they self-proclaimed themselves to be deity. That that those particular Caesars, the names are Vespasian, would be the specific one, that Josephus was recording the actions of Vespasian, and he was Messiah, and then those kind of got backfilled into the Christian religion, and then took on this flavor of being Christ. And they go in a little bit to, Christ, and what's interesting about the word Christ is that it means anointed one, and there's all kinds of overlap there, but basically they try to build that case up from the work of Josephus.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think it's a great summary. It's interesting. You talked about Christ. I think there's a lot of ways we could take this, because there was so much in that video, and I think, like you said, it's a starting point. But one of the things that did stand out to me is a lot of their claims. They were pointing to things and saying, because of X, this makes these things false over here. This makes Y false. And I found that a lot of times I agreed with their initial conclusion. I didn't disagree with what they were saying as X. Or their initial finding. I was disagreeing with what their conclusion was on that finding. So one of those examples was, they said, the reason the Flavian signature is true is because it fulfilled all these Old Testament biblical prophecies on this fake Messiah that they made up. It fulfilled all these Old Testament prophecies, and I was saying, yeah, Messiah did fulfill all these prophecies. The entire, there's so much packed into the Old Testament that talks to Messiah's coming, and that's why Passover is such an incredible holiday, and there's so much richness in the combination between the New Testament and the Old Testament, because they're one book seamlessly, and there's so much fulfillment in what Messiah did when he came to earth. And so I totally was agreeing that, yeah, absolutely, the Old Testament said all these prophecies, and the difference was, I believe that Messiah fulfilled them, rather than they just wrote this up to try to make some sort of correlation with the Old Testament.
Yeah. Yeah, I think too, Shaw, you're going to have to interrupt us if you want to get a word in, bro. But what it was, that they had taken a research approach that was based on a predefined conclusion, and it was very obvious from the language they used, from the kind of the types of emotional verbiage that they were speaking from. There's all these little clues that they already had a presupposition when they approached the material, and so they actually went. It was very clear. Like, if you've ever done any research, historically, archaeologically, if you've looked at Scripture, it starts to be clear when someone has a notion ahead of time and they go and approach the material trying to prove that notion. And that's very easy to do with almost any material. If you take a conclusion and you say, how can I look at the source material and prove this conclusion? It's very easy to do, rather than going all the way back and trying to build a holistic approach to the data and approach it without a preconceived notion and say, what picture does this data paint? And for example, specifically, they make the case that Rome fabricated Messiah and New Testament Christianity, and in fact all the New Testament, in order to control the people, in order to have this sort of placid Jesus, this passive Jesus. And they refer to a few verses such as, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and they make the case that, what kind of self-respecting, Jewish messianic zealot would render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and so they look at historically, they look at the movement of the zealots, and they say, here was a faction within Judaism who wanted a violent overthrow of the Roman government, and of course that was not acceptable to the Roman government, and so they wanted to crush that, and they were saying true messianic Judaism is this kingdom-based, violent, driven to action in a physical sense. to establish a Jewish kingdom, and they were basically making the case that that's the only true Messianic Judaism. But what they're completely missing is all the Old Testament history and the entire plan of God throughout history, where that is not the case. There are two components to the kingdom. The first is the suffering servant component that had to happen for mankind to be saved through Messiah. Then the second component is the millennial reign, in which all the kingdoms of the earth are destroyed and Messiah reigns physically. But that's in the future. And to prove this point, in the Old Testament, throughout the Old Testament, we see the hand of God and his purpose in judging his people through other government oppression. For example, when the Jews refused to obey him, actually it was all Israel at that point, when all Israel refused to obey the instructions that he had given them on how to run the nation, they were spewed out of the land. The Syrians conquered the northern tribes of Israel, and then later on the Babylonians conquered the southern tribes of Israel. And in those contexts, you see the perfect precursor to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. You did not see Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego taking up arms and trying to escape. You saw Yahweh blessing them in the context of their captivity and oppression, and still causing his purposes to be accomplished. And so at the time of Messiah, the Jewish state was captive to Rome. Rome was the occupier, if you will. And there's nothing scripturally inconsistent with that. And so I think they're missing a lot of those kind of broad understanding of data. They're coming to the scriptures with a secular mindset, and they're failing to see the finger of God throughout all of history.
Yeah, totally agree. I'm going to be going on and off mute because my computer's picking up a bunch of sound. So, anyways, yeah, I think one of the things I was really challenged by, that I really appreciated that you did, Andrew, and I'm still just getting ready to crack it open, so I didn't dive in as much. But I feel like that everything is based around Josephus, and so I think you ended up reading all of it, if not most of it, and I know Shaw started it, and I'm
about halfway, and
read the very opening of it.
There's 4 books, and in fact, I encourage every believer should read all of Josephus. It's amazing how faith affirming his work is, and I have a lot of issues with the way the video portrays him and his motives and so on and so forth. But just a quick commercial, go read Josephus. Seriously, it's awesome. Like, even in his day, he refers, for example, to Noah's Ark still being visited and viewable, and that was the first century. And so we have this continuous connecting thread that validates the scriptural record. So there's just nuggets in there like that over and over again. It's so valuable.
Yeah, and like Ken said, like we've been started reading it. I'm just a little bit in, and Andrew's halfway through. He said, but it's really accessible because it's public domain or whatever, so you can get downloads right out of Amazon for free. So it's really easy to access it. So I definitely encourage everybody to grab it. And I was just really challenged by that, just in general, when something's challenged, or when something like a new thought or idea, and it's based on a book or whatever, it's really dangerous to either jump on board or not without reading the information and really evaluating it for yourself. So that was a good challenge for me, and I'm still in just starting that journey as well.
And the tricky thing is, I know I kind of interrupted you, Ken, and get back to your point in a second, but the tricky thing is there is a lot of truth in the video Caesar's Messiah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of factually correct information, and I think that's what we've always wrestled with, in our faith, in terms of wanting to have a pure faith, in that there are a lot of historical things that we need to question and that we need to explore. And so the tricky thing is not reaching bad conclusions from the factual information, and that's where we have to sort between the difference of what's sort of man's opinion versus what does this fact point to, and a lot of those facts do point to a problem in the Christian foundation. The Christian foundation as a religion, as a Catholic inheritance, if you will, there are a lot of problems with that historically and scripturally. And we don't need to be afraid of those problems. We just need to explore them and reject the falsehood and embrace the truth. But anyway, Ken, you were talking about Josephus and kind of going back to the source and
Yeah, basically just saying, I think one of the greatest study points, I mean, everything, it would be like somebody challenging the Christian faith and reading the Bible, because everything's based on the Word of God. And so I would say almost everything that they're basing their findings on for rejecting Messiah and saying that it was this fake Messiah that was created by Roman government is all based on Josephus's writings. And so starting there starting there for research is a great place to go. And because I haven't dove in there, I'd love to hear what your guys' thoughts were from what you've read already.
Yeah, real quick, just interject. Like I was just thinking. Hopefully, this doesn't tailspin it too much, but like I have to say, like after saying that and then hearing you say it again, Ken, about like, yeah, it's important to read the things that like. There's plenty of things that I've definitely rejected in my life without reading the other side of it, based on the pure fact that like I just believe it to be untrue to start. And like I don't know. I guess I just challenge myself in my head with that. And like, where's the line? How do we do that? And I think that's part of the constant pursuit of truth. And like, I don't know. I guess how do you not bog yourself down? You know, because it's like just chasing things like everywhere. And I think that's something I've struggled with a lot in my walk. Is I'll just get distracted, even by I would say good things and like really truth-laced things too. And it's just like, but it's not really beneficial. And then like, yeah, how do you give everything the time of day and then like practice what we just preached to someone else? Like if, you know, like, did you read Josephus? Like, well, did I read Stephen Hawkins or whatever it is? Like, I have not. So like, yeah, I don't know. Like I'm trying to spin that around on myself a little bit and realize maybe I haven't done that as much. That's like maybe a whole different topic.
Yeah, and
Sorry.
well, no, that's great. I mean, the critical piece is, as with anything we do, we have to be spirit-led, and it's impossible to. I mean, Scripture says of the writing of books, there is no end. And so we know like there's this sort of academic and human knowledge, this human thirst for knowledge and information that never is never quenched. And so we could enter this sort of strictly academic intellectual pursuit of God where we just want to know all the information. But that gets us nowhere in the end, because it's not, Yahweh is not an infinite piece of data. He's infinite, but he's a person. And so we can't approach him intellectually in some aspects. Obviously there is an intellectual component because he is intellectual. But so we have to be led by the Spirit, and there could be a very strong case for diving into a particular resource because it impacts a relationship that he's put in our life. And it could strengthen that relationship or connection or whatever, and can also draw us closer to him.
Yeah.
But we have to be led by his Spirit. We can't just go saying, oh, I think there's all this value in Kabbalah, and maybe there's some mystic knowledge that I'm missing about God in Kabbalah, so I'm going to go become a Kabbalah expert. I mean, a lot of people have lost their faith that way, because then they start to get pulled away from the truth, even though there are things that Kabbalah borrows from truth and twists.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good way to define it, because even this, obviously, it came from Ken's experience and stuff, and just sharing, and then diving into it and being like, oh, that's really interesting. And like I think what it did for me is it, like, I just was, after I was done, like, and I'd say even still, since I watched it maybe a month ago, like I've been in this like a good tangent and tailspin, I would say, into just being like, okay, like where did we get the Bible? Where did we get, how did canonization work? How did like all those things? And it's been really fun and interesting, and it's topics that I've hit before, but like to revisit them with this in mind, and just like I feel like all it's doing is making my understanding and like foundation stronger, and it's, I don't know, it's really helpful. I like it when I get driven back to the word. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
same here. I
it's
found
good.
like one of the biggest neat things about this for me is it motivated me to dive into Josephus, which I had always wanted to do, and I just never got around to it, and I wish I had a lot sooner, because there's so much in there. I
Yeah.
think another thing, kind of circling back into something you were alluding to earlier, um, I think one of the problems is, and atheists do this all the time, other people do this all the time. They'll go and they want to confront religion and often specifically Christianity, and so they'll go to the Bible and they'll start reading the Bible for the sake of disproving the Bible, and that's actually honestly very easy to do if you approach it with a strictly secular mindset, and if you approach the English translation, and if you approach sort of what we have today as a Bible, there are many places where you can say, well, this isn't even consistent with itself, therefore how could it be true? And the problem with that approach is that you're not, when you examine the Bible in that context, you have to remember you're not examining the pure words of God. You're examining a product of human translation. You're examining a product of centuries of church interpretation and doctrinal bias. And so it's a it's an interesting thing to draw these conclusions. And just for a quick case in point, first chapter of Matthew, where it documents the generations of Messiah's lineage, it has 3 sections of 14 generations, but the third section is missing a generation. There's only 13, even though the text says there's 14. And so you could say right there, aha, like they couldn't even get the number of counting the generations correct. But when you go back and you study someone like Epiphanius, who was a church father in the fourth century, he writes that a scribe made an error and left out, there was 2 successive generations that had the same name, and they thought it was an error in the original, and so they left one out, and when in fact there are the right number of generations in the original. And that touches on what was the original language. And this video makes the point that the New Testament was all written in Greek, and a lot of modern scholarship would agree with that, but I disagree with that. I think most of, if not all, the New Testament was originally written in Hebrew. And I think the part of the problem is we have not only a translation in our English, we have a translation of a translation at best. And there's a lot that can get lost in that process.
I I I agree with everything that you just said, and I also am so amazed at God's power, because even in um, faulty documentation and everything else, I still believe it's the living word, and that God uses it time and time again to meet everybody where they're at, which is why it's so incredible. We talk a lot about the Bible being this living document, but really, it's really alive. I mean, like, God can use, really could use anything to express His truth to His people, but He's still using this tool that man has modified, and even Christian, religion has man has really broken, I think, Messiah's original vision for what the church was, and He still uses it for His glory, and He uses it to restore people, and He uses it for good, and I'm always blown away by that and super encouraged by it at the same time, knowing that there's that balance. And I think we're called to try to find those truths, but we can also rest in it's really His power, but there's a word for it. It's interesting. My vocabulary is basically cut in half since I've tried to learn Spanish. My English vocabulary is like, every time I learn a Spanish word, I lose an English word. um,
That's,
but uh,
but no, I can definitely, that's an awesome springboard to kind of this concept that this great way to illustrate it, and it'll make a lot more sense maybe to the geeks who are listening. But that is, you're right, that is the beauty of Yahweh's word, is that it's living and it's active, and it's and truly Messiah is the word. Like, there's this um, almost synonymous kind of entity between the word of Yah and Yahushua the Messiah, because we know that the Word became flesh, and so again, the Word is a person. It's not words on paper, and the amazing thing is of course you can approach the Bible as a book with a cynical mind, and you can see all these errors in the English, um, and you can write it off at that point, or as a Christian you could look at those errors and you could say, wow, there must be something wrong with my faith, and you can turn away from your faith. But the reality is that Father is so much bigger and smarter than that. And in technology, we do a lot of techniques to preserve data. For example, networks are known to have issues. There's a lot of miles and miles and hundreds of miles of cable, fiber optic, etc. There's data going across continents. It's moving around. It's going through just innumerable devices, and those lines are prone to what we call packet loss, to errors that just get introduced into the data as it's transmitted across the wire. And what routers do, what switches do, what these network devices do that are all along the way is they have built-in error correction. And they use different techniques to do this, but a common technique is a checksum. And so it'll take the entire data, it'll analyze that, it'll crunch it into a mathematical portion, it'll insert that mathematical portion into the data itself, so that when the data gets to the other side, the receiving end can look at that data, compare it to the checksum. It'll go through the same mathematical calculation that the original one did, and it'll check those two values. And if they match, it says, hey, I've got a complete transmission. The data is good. If they don't match, it can tell from the way in which they do not match, it can tell what data was corrupted in transmission. And it basically self-corrects. It puts the packet back together, and then it sends it onto the final, and the data is good. And so there's a self-correcting mechanism in technology and in networking and all these different things to keep the data good as much as possible. Issues still happen. Errors still happen. But the Word of God is the exact same way. It is self-correcting, and if you have a relationship with the Creator of the universe, part of that self-correcting mechanism is His Spirit. Another part is the brain that He's given us. We're not stuck with only the English in the NIV. We can go back to the Hebrew. We can use a concordance. We can compare different translations. We can do due diligence to find out, hey, is what I've been taught the truth, and is that what Yahuwah really meant when he said that? And that's the age-old question that was in the Garden of Eden. I mean, that was the challenge, right, to Eve or Hava. The serpent said, did God really say? And I think that's in this video, Caesar's Messiah and some of these other things, that's kind of really the sort of the tempting question, is did God really say? Even when Messiah was being tempted in the wilderness by the adversary himself, by Satan, Satan said, it is written, like, if cast yourself down, because it's written that he will bear you up on angels' wings. And so there's that fundamental thing, even using Scripture against the Scripture, the Word of Yah, the author, and if Satan thought that was a valid tactic against the one who wrote it, and he tried to get away with it to the one who wrote it, how much more effective is that tactic against humanity?
Yeah, that was incredible. Glad that we have you on the show to do analogies like that.
Technology comes in handy once in a while, I guess. But yeah, I mean, and it's amazing because not only do we have the self-correcting tools of the original languages, which in some cases we might not have the original language. I believe we don't have the original language necessarily for some of the New Testament books, even though we know there's evidence surrounding those that it was probably Hebrew. We don't have the original Hebrew in most cases, but we have historians, we have archaeology, we have all these other incredible resources that are still evidence to compile the accurate picture. And some people would say that the New Testament is not a valid historical document. You should really go look up some statistics about that, and maybe we'll include a link to a video with our podcast, but when you compare contemporary historical documents with the New Testament, the comparisons are astounding in terms of not only the accuracy of what they record, but also the amount that's recorded. The New Testament records far more about history than some of the other contemporary historians, and it's a I don't have the specifics off the top of my head, but it's a fascinating comparison when you start to approach it just from standard textual criticism and what does it say about the time period and all of those details.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah, it's
I'm
cool.
remembering one of those specific things is kind of coming back to me a little bit. I may butcher this, so please go look it up for yourself because it's kind of foggy. But for instance, about all of the Caesars, about all of the Roman rulers, there are contemporary references that are minor, and some of the most voluminous references to those contemporary secular rulers are found in the New Testament. In fact, the New Testament is by far one of the most reliable sources of those contemporary rulers. But go check that out for yourself. We'll post a link as well because it's a fascinating point on that.
Yeah. I like what you said before about reasons to study, because there is an ocean of wealth of information, and I love the idea of making it relational based and understanding where's the Spirit calling us to study, when and why. And that really was the heartbeat of all this. I ran into an incredible guy that had a passion for truth, and he challenged me with a lot of things. And I didn't want to just respond in my traditional kind of Christian doctrine I've been taught, and hopefully as I've grown, I've changed not to do that ever. But it was like, let me see what you're, like I really want to get to know this guy. I want to know what he believed, and he was challenging what I believed. And so before just rejecting it, I really wanted to study it, and that's why I'm so thankful for community, because I didn't just get to unpack it myself. You guys jumped in and said, hey, we'd love to check this out too. And so full circle, how does somebody like my new friend take and study the Word and allow it to have the balance between allowing it to be Spirit-led and allowing it to be an educational document as well, and finding that balance when you may not even believe in God anymore? Like, how does a non-believer try to approach this to find truth and find that balance of it being a living document?
Oh yeah, that is so tough.
It's really good. Like I can apply the same question, like to even just all the stuff that I've been learning lately, like over the past year or two, that either was introduced by you guys or just, reading different things and just my own pursuit. Like I'm like, man, what questions can I put out in front of other people, or how can I push them towards like this same experience, which I find incredible. Um, like how do I get them there? Just
hmm Well, and I think, and just correct me if I'm wrong, Ken, but I think if I remember rightly, your friend still believes in God, ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
um, but he's just not sure about Jesus Christ anymore because of all the evidence that seems to be out there relating to sort of that push and pull of whether did the Romans invent him, was he a true historical figure, and so on and so forth. Um, and so I mean, for me, that answer at the most fundamental level is you can't look for your creator if you don't believe you have a creator. And a lot of people have rejected the idea that there even is a creator, and I think those people, it's going to be impossible for them to find spiritual truth. Um, and of course, a lot of people will find their own quote unquote spiritual truth in either New Age or mysticism or other areas. Others will be purely secular, and they'll find their quote unquote truth in pure science or pure logic or pure reason. But the reality is that any of those pursuits are denying an aspect of who we are as human beings. I mean, we are spirit, body, mind, and if we don't have a holistic belief that factors all of those components in, for example, the mystical kind of New Age kind of all that side of it would reject the scientific and sort of intellectual side of it sometimes, whereas the scientific side would reject the spiritual side, and you can't have a complete grasp on reality when you reject part of reality. And so I think that Yah is amazing, and I've heard so many countless stories of people who have had encounters with him strictly on the basis of saying, if you're real, show me. And in that question, it's not like some people would say, I don't believe you're real, so you're going to have to prove it to me if you are. And that's a rebellious kind of, you know, arrogant attitude, prideful attitude, and they're probably not going to get a response. But for those who truly hunger, they feel that sort of gap in themselves of knowing that they are eternal, and knowing that there must be something eternal that they need to be connected to, and asking humbly, God, if you're real, like show me, like if that's their heart's cry, and if they truly want to know truth, then I believe Yahweh will show up. I believe He'll put people, situations, circumstances, things in their life to put them on a path to get to Him. And ultimately, somewhere along that path is Yahushua Messiah, because He's the way, the truth, and the life. And of course, a lot of religions would say there are many roads that lead to heaven or whatever, and I disagree with that. It sounds, it sounds closed-minded. It sounds whatever. You want to put a political spin on that, a politically correct spin on that, but I believe we're created in the image of Yahweh. He provided His Son, Yahushua the Messiah, as our mechanism of restoration to Him, because we rejected His ways. And so I think for the person who's truly seeking truth, they, and truly seeking their Creator, He'll provide that way.
Yeah. I'm going to throw a wrench into it slightly. What you said was incredible, and I feel like I'm excited to share what you said with some of my friends, because I have some friends that definitely they want to see God in a physical way, but they've rejected Him altogether. And I feel like you said it in a very elegant way. What's interesting about my friend down here in Costa Rica is that, as you mentioned, he does believe in God. And we basically had the conversation that you just said, and his fundamental thing was basically everything that I would say Messiah has done in my life, he would just say, I agree with you, I just believe it's God, not Messiah. And he would say, did you physically meet Jesus? That was his question to me when I started saying, like, these are all the things that Yahushua has done in my life. He kept asking me that, and he's saying, because if you did, you probably saw him with facial hair, and he looked like this, and he was explaining that to him, God is both female and male, and God meets us where we're at different times, and so there's this traditional figure that most people see, but he truly believes in God, he believes in the power of God, and at the root of everything, I'd say we agree on 90%. It's just this idea that Messiah was made up. And so then he's asking a different question of, how does he know Messiah is alive when every active thing that Messiah has done in my life, he's saying, did he come down and did you meet him in the person? Did he say, my name is Jesus? And if not, is there a possibility that could just be God? And so like I said, that's a whole wrench in this whole thing, but it was an interesting question that I appreciated and was challenged by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think, one of the reasons we're even kind of going into this topic is because I've seen a trend lately as I started to, again, it's that paradigm of once you start to notice something, you start to see it everywhere. And I've started seeing this trend where I think part of the fundamental crisis that we see in Christianity, which it doesn't bother me because I think a lot of things, need to be moved away from in Christianity and restored back to more of a foundational truth. But one of the crises in Christianity is that our young generations have not been taught the true foundation, and so it's very easy to reject a false foundation once you are exposed to truth. And I think that a lot of Christians are not equipped. There was a staggering statistic. I shouldn't throw it out there because I don't remember the source, but it's very, very high percentage of university students who walk away from the faith in their first year of university, and then of those that are left, another staggering statistic of those that walk away in the second or third year. And why is that? And I think it's because we haven't been grounded in the true foundation, and so we've been taught this particular Jesus Christ that that has that as a concept, as a philosophy, as a I dare say fabrication, has so many holes in it. And when faith is focused on this Jesus Christ that is inconsistent with so much of the Scripture itself, no wonder so many people leave that Jesus Christ, because um, it's missing so much of the reality of who he is as a person, and who he came to be, and his relationship with the Father, and even who he was throughout all of the Old Testament. Yahushua the Messiah is in the Old Testament in bodily form in so many cases, and he's worshipped, he talks to people, he reveals his plan to people in the Old Testament, in so many forms, including physical, the appearance of human form. But we haven't been taught that, and so we also don't know that as the Father's nature was reflected in him, we don't realize that his character is the character of the Father. And so to some extent what your friend is saying is true. Messiah himself said, I and the Father are one, but he also said the Father is greater than I, and so there is a bit of a paradox there. Um, but ultimately, the thing is, we can't completely understand him or reach a complete valid conclusion purely intellectually. We could create all kinds of logical arguments and counter arguments that would incorrectly define him. But ultimately, we can only completely understand him in a combination of logic, reason, intellect, and spirit. Um, And yeah, no, it's a valid question. We
Yeah.
should all ask
Everything.
we should all ask ourselves that. How many Christians would say, like, if that's an awesome question. If they say, well, how do you know Jesus is real? When did you see him last? When did you talk to him last? And not just pray to him, but when did you hear from him? And those are all really awesome questions.
Yeah, I agree. Well said. I want to jump in, but I think we're getting pretty late, and I don't want to go too far over. So
Yeah,
I don't
but
know
this
if
is
you
a
have any
rich.
final
No,
thoughts.
yeah, a million. But this is a really rich mine to explore, and we'll keep. I've got 3 pages of notes from that video. I want to go back and watch the video again a little bit more systematically, and kind of put some additional microscopes on some of the specific things that they explore, and kind of dissect that a little bit more, and maybe in another podcast.
Yeah, for sure. One question I did have for you in reading Josephus, and this was trying to get to before. Did you say that he had his own conclusions in his own words that kind of defined that he wasn't stating, like, they were kind of contradictory to the movie's outcomes?
Yeah, the movie had a couple of major conclusions that drove the entire lens through which they interpreted Josephus. And one of those was, again, that he was a propagandist. Another one was, by implication, that his trustworthy as, in terms of face value. Because of being a propagandist, he motive behind what he wrote, and that he might not be a valid historical source is kind of what they were getting at. And I came to a very different conclusion, and maybe we can get into more specifics another time. The high level summary is that he himself was very sincere in what he wrote. He was not afraid to write about his own shortcomings, his own, he did not whitewash himself. He did not try to portray himself as anything that was perfect. And so I think there's this element of honesty to him that comes through his writing, in terms of making plain his own motivations wherever he was critical of himself, making plain his own shortcomings. And so I think that lends a much greater amount of credibility to what he wrote than the video portrays. In addition to that, he also talks about some of his contemporaries who were attempting to make historical accounts as well, and he, of course, favors his own writings over theirs, and he points to their ulterior motives. So there's some awareness there, and whether you buy that or not, obviously, like, that could be seen as a technique to add credibility to himself while taking credibility away from others, and maybe that's devious. You could make an argument there, but overall, like I said, you have to kind of read it for yourself and form your own opinion. So far, halfway through, he's got 4 major works. I'm about halfway through, finished one, halfway through the second one. My own conclusion, opinion so far is that he's very sincere person, and that his writings are quite reliable, and not from a propaganda standpoint, but just from a factual record of what happened.
Yeah, it's interesting. I finished a book 2 days ago from one of our clients, Iscariot, and she actually references a lot of his writings in there. And I didn't realize that. It's a fictional book, but it's really good. It gives a really good, it's a fictional story about what it was like to be Judas. And she really does a good job of painting the picture of what Israel was like and being inhabited by Romans and everything. But at the end, I was reading through all of her references, and I was like, oh, and she references Josephus in a few different places, and I was like, that's interesting, as some of her historical accounts. So, but that's kind of off tangent. I probably shouldn't ask that question, but everything that you said before that, I think it was good, and I think, like you were saying, this is just the tip of the iceberg and something that we're going to keep studying. But the heart behind it is, I mean, I really respect this guy, and I feel like now you guys know you know him as well, because we're all kind of on this journey together, and I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged that I have a community that I can walk through with this, and I'm excited to see what kind of conversations we're going to bring up through this.
Yeah, no, and I think that's actually a great note to leave off on, and set up the time for next week. Specifically zooming into Josephus, and why do I say that's what do I base my opinion on? Let's look at some of his quotes. Let's dive into what he wrote and what's in there, and kind of maybe inspire some of our listeners to go out there and dig in for themselves. But kind of taking the claims, we can set the claims of the video side by side with what Josephus actually wrote, and we can say, hey, are these compatible? Are their claims supported by what he wrote? And let's look at the specifics.
Cool.
Awesome. Yeah, that was really good stuff.
All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it.
Sounds good. I really wanted to find that quote, but maybe we'll have to just roll that into next time. I still can't find that silly thing.
We throw it in the notes, the comments section.
Awesome.
Awesome.